So in this video and a series of videos, I'm going to go over some of the drawing tools in Adobe Animate so I can explain them in detail. So the first one I'm going to show is this fluid brush. First thing to understand about the fluid brush is it's what they call a GPU brush, or a graphics processing unit brush. So if you don't have a graphics processor that is compatible with this brush, it's probably going to show that it's grayed out, or it won't let you select it. In my case, I am running a graphics card that will support it. So it's a very graphics intensive brush. It's a fairly new brush in Animate. Came out in 2020 that was sort of based on an old brush. The cool thing is I'm using a Cintiq, and you can use this. You don't need to use a Cintiq for this brush. You can use a mouse, a Cintiq or a tablet work really well. And I'm going to show you a couple things when you select this brush. You have a couple options down here at the bottom, and this first one is use velocity. And with that turned on, when you have that enabled, which that's turned on, when you have it enabled, what's going to happen is you've got a setting over here in the properties panel for the tool. So if you go over to properties, you'll see the tool is selected, and you're going to see this velocity. So I'm going to kind of turn this up a bit. When I go very slow with this brush, you're going to see it adds something a little bit more of a contour, like the paint is spilling out of the brush. If I go really fast, right, it depending on the speed that you go, right, it's going to give you a different kind of contour to the brush. You also see it's kind of smoothing out a little bit. So when I kind of brush with that, if I go really fast, right, or if I go slow, you see that it varies due to that velocity. I can kind of turn that down. If it's set to 0, you're not going to have anything, but it uses the velocity, how fast you're going with the brush to make it affect. So if it's all the way up, you're going to see that change. If you go slow, it's going to make a very thin line, and I'm trying to put the same amount of pressure because I also have used pressure on. So if I turn that off, you should be able to see that if I go really slow, right, same amount of pressure, right, it's changing the nature of the brush depending on how fast or how slow I go. So I can turn that down, or I can go the other direction. I can make it a negative number. So that way, if I go really slow, it's putting a lot of paint down, which is sort of like you put the paint on a canvas, and it's putting a lot of paint down as you're going. If you go really fast, it's putting less paint. So that's probably a little bit more, it's closer to what you might see with an actual brush, and you can kind of get these neat little effects with that brush. So that's velocity. That's when velocity is on. This use pressure is the pressure sensitivity of so if you're using a tablet or you're using a Wacom Cintiq, or, there's other pen tablets or pen displays that you can purchase out there. But if you have that pen pressure or use pressure on, I'm going to press very lightly and paint. And actually, I'm going to turn velocity off so you don't see that effect depending on how fast or how slow I go. But if I push down harder, I'm going to get a lot more paint. It's sort of mimicking the way a brush would work. So really light, I'm going to go really light. You can kind of see it's a very thin line. I'm also getting some smoothing. Notice how when I paint, if I can make little jagged lines, and it's going to try to smooth that out. I'll talk about smoothing in a second. But that's how that kind of works. And I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to hide this one. Hide that one and show this one so I can kind of paint fresh. So that's velocity, and that's use pressure. By the way, these buttons are mimicked over when you have the tool selected and you're in the tool section of the properties. You're going to see that these are options up at the top. So it says use pressure here, and it's changed the brush size based on velocity. So they're a little reversed, but it's the same kind of idea. This button right here, same as this button right here. When I select that, normally it's paint normal. Right, so this is just a normal paint mode. If I go down to paint fills, right, you're going to see it's just painting. It's just painting a fill. And interestingly, I think in 2020 they took out the ability to add a stroke to this paintbrush, because I don't see this here anymore. I don't think it has anything to do with my particular setup, but you'll notice that it just says fill. This might seem redundant that it says paint fills, but I'm going to show you the paint behind, which is kind of cool. So if I switch my colors, I'm going to choose this, and I'm going to choose a different color. If I don't have that on, let me go to paint normal, and I paint, it goes over the top. It also, by the way, just so everybody knows, I'm going to go to sub-selection. It merges these two. So whenever I paint over it, it's merging the paint, right? So if I go to this fluid brush and I change to paint behind, right, and then I paint, it's going to go behind the previous layers. So if I'm going to choose a different color for the paint, I'm going to do this, and it's going to put it behind that layer. So the normal mode is painting on top, right? Then you could switch it to a paint behind. There's also paint selection. And the interesting thing that this will kind of mess you up if you're not paying close enough attention, that right now I have nothing selected, so I can paint all I want and it just disappears, right? But what I can do is I can select something with a selection tool. I'm going to choose the lasso tool, and I'm going to say just lasso around this, and then I'm going to use this paint selection that I have selected, and I can do this, and it's just going to paint whatever is selected. It won't paint anything else. And this can come in handy when you want just one little section that you want to outline, that you want it to be a different paint, right? So that's kind of it's a cool feature, but it tends to be something I use very selectively. And then there's paint inside, and you'll notice that what it's doing is it's painting inside. It's getting a little confusing, but I'm going to go ahead and I'll just paint. I'm going to go to paint normal, right? And I'm going to switch my color to something like this, and I'm going to switch it to paint inside. And then what's going to happen is when I have the brush over this paint and I do this, you'll notice it fits to that contour. It's sort of like the paint selection, or that where you can select something and paint. But if I paint out here, it won't paint on top of that, right? But if I choose on whatever has a fill already and I paint in that, it's going to paint in that. It's going to keep those boundaries, right? So it's another way that I can kind of paint inside of a different shape. And you'll notice I'd have to be right on top of this little orange to paint right there, right? So it's kind of a cool way that I can sort of repaint a whole different thing, right? As long as I'm right there on the lines, right? Something like that. So I could repaint it. I can also use the paint bucket tool and do something like that. But if, this interesting design that I created over here, I could actually use the paint behind, or paint inside, and then I can choose, say, this right here, and I can just do that, right? I can just kind of take a little bit of a section and repaint that area for whatever reason. I know I'm making a very interesting design here, but not meant to be anything, just to kind of display what's going on with the brush. So if you're just out in the middle of nowhere when you're doing the paint inside, it's really just using it like a regular paintbrush, because there's nothing in there to paint. So that's pretty much all these little selections. You also have the object drawing mode for this brush. This can kind of confuse some people, because when this is on, when you paint, what it's going to do is it's going to group it. It's going to make it a little group. So to use this object drawing mode, I'm going to go back to paint normal, so that it's just drawing, it's just painting normally in here. And then with this object drawing mode on, right, you can also see that it's on right here. When it's sort of highlighted, it's on. So when I now paint, when I go to the selection tool and I select that, you'll see it's got a little bounding box around it, right? So what it's done is basically grouped it. The reason you can do that, or the reason you might want to do that, is so that you can use the same layer to paint multiple objects over each other without having them to combine. Like I said, like normally when you paint, I'm going to turn this off. Normally when I paint like this, these two things are going to be combined, right? They're sort of locked in together. And even when you look at their outlines, you're going to see that they're connected, right? It merged it when you painted over one another. So with this object drawing mode on, and I paint across this, and then I go back to the selection tool, you're going to notice that's an object, that's an object. It's basically grouped it so it won't merge it. In some cases, you might want to do that. With the sub-selection tool, you can just select that and grab the points and edit the points that way. Typically, when you're editing this, if you want to edit this shape, you have to double-click it and go into the drawing mode. That shows it's grouped. Whenever you do that, you're going to see this little bounding box. So this is a way you can combine them. This is a way you can keep them separate. It's kind of a nice little feature. So I'm going to go back to the fluid brush and go back to the tools. You can change the fill color here. I kind of discussed what this is. Use pressure. Again, this is change the brush size based on the velocity. This is lock the fill. I tend to not use that because then I can change if I don't want to change it, then you can lock it. And then these are the paint modes. They are the same over here. And then the same with this one is the object drawing mode. So I'm going to turn that off. So you got fill, and there's a whole bunch of settings for this fluid brush, which is pretty awesome. So you've got this size. If you're using a tablet or Cintiq, a pen display or a pen tablet, this is the highest size it'll go with pen pressure. So if I set it to 1, it doesn't matter how hard I press, it's only going to make the size 1, it's like 1 pixel wide. I want to set this to the widest I want if I'm using a tablet or a pen display. If you're using a mouse, this will set the size. You can actually use the bracket keys on your keyboard to raise and lower the size too. That's the shortcut, right? But if you're using a tablet or a pen display, set this to the highest size you want the pen to have, and then just adjust your pressure when you press down. Right? So I have this velocity set way down, so I'm going to turn it up a little bit, because if I go really slow, it's going to put out a lot of paint. If I go really fast, it's going to put out less paint. So I want to sort of adjust that size based on velocity and pressure. So if I'm using both velocity and pressure, then if I go really slow and press really hard, it's going to be a lot of paint, right? And this is going to be the overall size. If that's the highest I want it to be with all that pressure, that's what I'm going to set it at, right? Then if I go really fast and go really light, it's going to be a thin line, right? So if I'm going to make that smaller, I'm going to do this. So really fast and really, that's kind of the idea behind that, right? Then you have this stabilizer, and I'm going to clean out. I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to hide this one, right? And I'm going to just switch back to the fluid brush, to the tools. There's this stabilizer. Right now it's set to 0. And I'm going to turn down the smoothing. So when I do this, you're going to see, I'm actually going to turn down the size a little bit, right? So if I turn up the stabilizer, what the stabilizer does is it helps to avoid like these minor imperfections when you're drawing, or variations when you're drawing. What it's going to do is it sort of adjusts these sort of edges here. You'll notice that these are a little bit more harsh, and let me bring that size down just a little bit more so you can kind of see that, right? And if I bring that stabilizer down, you'll see that there's a lot more imperfections in kind of when I'm drawing. You might want that. You might want to see that, or you might want to see it smoothed out a little bit, right? So that's the stabilizer. Now with curve smoothing, it helps reduce the overall control points. So where a stabilizer tries to keep up the same amount of points on your line, so you notice how many points are there, how many points are here, and how many points are here, right? If I go to smoothing, and I'm going to bring smoothing pretty far up, and then I can keep the stabilizer in the middle, and then I draw our paint. Now I'm going to look at those points, and you're going to see that there's quite fewer of them, which is really kind of the ideal. You have too many points. Hey, if you're doing animation, it's more work for it to do the same kind of thing. So I want to use the fewest points possible to get the right kind of shape. Now, if you're drawing really detailed and you want to see a lot more points, you can just add more smoothing. So that's kind of what that smoothing setting does. It's how many, curve smoothing is how many points it has along the curve, right? The stabilizer tries to smooth out the lines. I know it might sound misleading, it being smoothing and stabilizer, but it tries to keep the line a little bit smoother along the edges, right? With still keeping the same amount of points based on the curve smoothing. So that's kind of how it works. I usually turn curve smoothing up pretty high unless I want to see more detail out of it, right? So that's that. Now roundness, if I bring down the roundness, you can kind of see that it makes it look like the brush, like I even have some tilt control in the brush. It makes it look like it's got a chisel tip, right? So this is kind of adding a roundness to the brush. So this is sort of a straight flat brush. And then as I add more roundness, it makes the brush a little bit more rounded. I'm going to bring up the size a little bit so you can see that, right? If I bring down the roundness of that brush, then it's more like a chisel tip, like I'm working with a felt tip pen rather than a brush itself, right? So that's roundness. I tend to not have these things all the way up all the time, but it really depends on what I'm drawing at the time. Let's take this down, the roundness go down all the way, and I'm going to bring the angle up a little bit. You're going to kind of see that it changes the angle of that chisel on the tip of the brush. You can kind of see it's going at a different angle. So depending on if you want a chisel on your tip on your pen that goes in this angle, no matter what angle I go with the pen, it's going to do it that same angle. So if you have the roundness all the way up, the angle doesn't really matter because it's just round. And I'm going to clear some of this out. Oop. There we go. All right, go back to the fluid brush. The fluid brush has a lot of options, as you can already tell as I'm going through all this. So we've already talked about velocity, but I'm going to go up to taper here. And I'm going to do this. So you'll notice kind of an art pen might do is that when you start out, it's tapered at the start and tapered at the end. So if I take that taper down, you can kind of see it just starts rounded, it kind of starts with me adding ink or paint and then kind of spreading it out as I go on. On taper, it makes it look like, I've kind of started with a smaller pen size and it flows out of the pen rather than a paintbrush. So it's going to give this sort of tapered look to it. This brush has a lot of configuration, a lot of capabilities. I already talked about velocity and pressure. You can also change your presets. So the zoom with stage, by the way, is if you zoom in, like right now I'm at 100%. If you zoom in with the stage, if I go to say 200% and I paint, it's going to be the same effective size. If I don't zoom, then it's going to, when I zoom out, let's go like this. It keeps the size independent of the size of the scene or the stage, right? I usually keep the zoom size with stage on so that it's doing the same size brush no matter how I've zoomed in. However, you might be working on some detailed areas, and when you zoom in, you want it to kind of have that same kind of look. So if I go out to 25%, I might not want it to be that big. That's how that works. You can save as a preset, and it'll save all these settings as one preset. You can kind of choose these presets. So if you're always going back to a certain brush, you can do that, and then that'll just sort of choose them. And if you save the changes, like you open up a preset and you save changes, it's going to save over that preset, which is kind of a cool thing. That's the fluid brush in a nutshell. There's a simpler brush, which is the classic brush. So if you don't have access to this fluid brush based on your graphics processor, you can choose the classic brush, and it has a lot less configuration. It's got fill, it still has pressure. It has this use tilt. This is the shape of the brush. So if I choose this one and I paint like this, let me zoom in. Let's go to 100%. So if I paint, I'm going to make this size a little bit bigger. If I paint like this, if I tilt the brush, I can start this way, and if I tilt the brush a different way, it'll use that tilt. So that's a use tilt. Again, it won't work with a mouse. You have to use a pen that supports tilt. And then again, use pressure. If you have used pressure on, it'll this is the minimum size of the brush, and this is the maximum size of the brush. So if I'm really light, it'll do that. If I press heavier, it'll add more paint. And again, these are the shapes of that brush. It's a much more simple brush, but it's effective. It has some of the same normal fills behind, selection, and paint inside, and it does the same drawing mode. So, but you have a lot less configuration, right? You just have size, the minimum size if you're using pressure, and then smoothing again. Smoothing is how many points along that. So if I go, further down and I look at these points, there's a lot of points. If I go back to the classic brush and bring the smoothing up and paint with that, and then select this, you're going to see a lot fewer points, but you still get a lot more definition, or still get a good amount of definition. Here, see how it looks pretty choppy. Here it looks a little bit smooth. So it really depends on kind of what you're looking for. You're looking for a choppier line or a choppier outline or what. That's pretty much it. You can create your own pen shapes by selecting this. So you can actually define your own nib, so the look of the pen. Or you can choose one of these presets, which is the shape of the pen. And again, you can save as preset, zoom size with stage, and sync settings with eraser, meaning that if you have a tablet and you're using a pen, it usually has eraser. If you flip the pen over, it has eraser on the other side. If you choose to sync settings with eraser, then it's going to use whatever these settings are for the eraser. I usually have that off. And what I end up doing is I go to the eraser tool and I set the settings in that eraser. So if I want the size to be much larger and I want it to be a different brush size, so like this looks more like a brush to me, let me change that. If I go back to that classic brush and I switch over the pen to make an eraser, right, it should be using the eraser settings to do that, as long as I have this sync settings with eraser on. See that, how that is using this setup, but if I turn that off, I'm going to choose a different brush and a different size, go to the eraser, and then switch that over. You should be able to see that that keeps its setting. And so when I flip the eraser over, it should be doing, let me change the size a little bit. So if I want to erase, I can erase with that, and then switch back to the classic brush, and it keeps its own setting. So that's why I turned that off, because I want the eraser to be a little bit different, and I don't have to keep switching back to the eraser to as long if I want to make changes, I do that. But all I have to do is switch the pen around, and it should be doing that. In this case, it's choosing that setting for some odd reason. It still is synchronizing it, but you should be able to go through and change that setting and get it to work with that eraser. Right. In this case, it's using that pen's if I'm on that brush, it's using that brush setting. But let's say I move to the eraser or the pencil, it'll do that. Right. So I can erase using those settings. Yep. And if I go to the eraser, this one thing, since I'm bringing up the eraser, if you have this erase on active layer, just so you know, if I have all these active or I'm viewing them all, it's only with that setting set for the eraser. Go back to tool, erase on active layer. It's only going to erase what's on layer 1, right? So even when I do that, it looks like it goes away, but it comes right back. It's because I've got that set. If I want to erase every layer down, which is not typical, usually I just want to erase what's on the layer, just the same with paint. I can't paint on layer 3 or 2 if I'm on layer 3, right? If I'm on layer 2, I can't paint on layer 3. Same thing with the eraser. But if I want to erase everything down, right, I go to the tool, change that from erase on active layer, and now I can erase everything. So that's kind of a quick introduction to the eraser tool. And some of the options are the same with the eraser. Anyway, hopefully that helps, and good luck with it. Have fun.